Hello, Adult Sunday School Leader. Have you ever been in a situation that was bad, and if you didn't do something, it was going to get worse? Well, about 20 years ago, I was serving in another church, and our senior pastor, in his sermon one Sunday, stated that there would be no liberals in heaven. Of course, that outlandish comment caused quite a stir, and to make it worse, he went on vacation the next day on Monday morning. Now, regardless of your political stance, I hope you agree with me that this blanket statement is not true. Well, in our church then, where I served, there was this sweet older couple who worked on the county Democratic committee. They were very offended and said they were leaving the church. I knew I had to resolve this issue quickly, so pastor was on vacation, so I went over to their house. I met with them, tried to smooth things over. Fortunately, they did come back to our church. Now, if I had not been proactive and stepped in to keep that bad situation from getting worse, most likely there would be these hurt feelings that would fester, and they would probably still be unresolved. Have you ever found yourself in that kind of situation where you had to intervene? You know, sometimes it's like that TV show, The Intervention Show, when a group of people meet with an individual who's going down a wrong path and they're trying to get him or her to change their course of action. Sometimes it's like my example, where you have to meet with a party who's been offended. And that's kind of like our story today in 1 Samuel, as we are in the standalone unit. It's called Abigail, a woman of wisdom. The focal passage, it's various verses out of 1 Samuel 25. And the point is, step in to keep a bad situation from getting worse. Well, if you keep your notes or lesson material from previous Sunday school lessons, you can look back to the material for June 16, 2019, or November 10 of 2013 for additional help on this passage. So let's get some context to our lesson today. We're in Old Testament times, and Israel's first king, Saul, is on the throne. Now, Saul, he's jealous of David's popularity. He's been on the hunt for David off and on. And in the previous chapter, in 1 Samuel 24, David had an opportunity to kill Saul, but he didn't do it. Also, the prophet Samuel has just died. Now, let's get a little geographical context as well. Let's look at this first map. It should be fairly familiar to us. This is a map of Israel in Old Testament times. Now, we're going to zoom in a little bit on the southern portion of that map. And we're going to see that area that became known as Judah, that's kind of what we're focusing on here. And zooming in just a little bit more, you'll see some different towns I've highlighted here. You got Jerusalem, which is toward the top of the map, and just north of it is Ramah. Now this is where Samuel was buried. Now going south, you'll see Mahon and Carmel. These two towns are in our story today. There's one other area that's not marked, and that's the desert or the wilderness of Paran. The Bible scholars have guessed, but they're not really sure where that is, but they just know that it was somewhere south of that area that became known as Judah. Well, in our story today, there are three main characters. There's Nabal, his wife Abigail, and David. Nabal had an odd name. It meant foolish or fool. And Nabal had property at Carmel, and he was from the town of Maon, which we saw earlier on the map. He was a rich man. He owned 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep. And the Bible tells us that he was a Calebite, meaning that he was a descendant of Caleb. Of course, we remember that Joshua and Caleb were the two spies that returned that favorable report when they spied out on the promised land. Well, the Bible tells us that Nabal was a surly man. He was mean. Do you remember in those old Western movies, there'd be some guy and he was described as an ornery old cuss? I don't even think that comes close to describing Mr. Nabal, or Nabal, however you want to say that. However, his wife, Abigail, she was beautiful. She was intelligent. She seemed to be the polar opposite of her husband. It's kind of like the story of Beauty and the Beast. Well, sheep shearing time was in the spring and the early fall. It was kind of like harvest time for ranchers. It was that time to sell and make money. It was a time of feasting, and that was the time frame that we're in here in this story. David and his men, he had about 600 men with him. They were in this area where Nabal's flocks were being tended. And David and his men were They were in the area, and they basically offered protection to Nabal's shepherds while they watched after their flocks. When the sheep were brought in to be sheared, David sent 10 of his men to Nabal. And they were to extend a blessing to Nabal and his household for good health, for long life. Ironically, neither one of those came about. These men reminded Nabal that as David and his men protected his flocks, they didn't harm anybody. Nothing was missing. They didn't take anything. And since this was a time of feasting, they asked Nabal to give them whatever he deemed worthy for what they had done for him. Well, this might sound a little bit like a mafia protection scheme, but we've got to remember, this is a different time and a different place. Both the Old Testament law and the culture of the area included providing for those in need and providing for outcasts, and also nomads. They had a right to expect others to be hospitable to them. It was also a feast day, and so there was plenty of food that was going to be available. So this was not an unreasonable or out of the ordinary request. Based on the culture of the day, Nabal should have been glad to fulfill David's request. But what did he do? Instead of him being generous, he showed his true self. He refused, and he implied that David and his men were nothing more than a bunch of rogue slaves who had broken away from their master. Why should I give my bread and water and meat to you guys? There's no way I'm going to do that. Well, the men went back and reported to David. David immediately told his men, take up your swords. And he took 400 of his 600 men to go encounter Nabal. Well, that's the background. That takes us to our first set of scriptures in 1 Samuel 25, verses 14 through 17. Nabal's servants heard Nabal's ranting, and they went and reported it to Abigail, the wife. Now, that may seem odd, right? Why approach the wife instead of the husband? He was the one that was responsible for making those remarks. Well, it was because Nabal was so wicked and mean, nobody could talk any sense into him. Nobody could talk sensibly about anything he had done wrong. Well, here's a question you can ask your class. What's the difference between tattling and giving someone information to keep a bad situation from getting worse? I believe it boils down to motive. Is the reason for sharing the information to assist in helping a bad situation become better, or is it to, as we say, to stir the pot, to get the other person riled up and to get them on your side of the issue? So, the servant who was talking to Abigail told her that David and his men, they treated them very well. David's guys never harassed them. Nothing of theirs were ever taken the whole time. In fact, they protected them, being like a wall around them while they herded sheep. Now, I'm not sure what the servant wanted Abigail to do, since Nabal was so mean, but if nothing was done, that servant would most likely going to be killed by David and his men. The last part of verse 17 shows how little Nabal's workers thought of him. Of course, most workers complain about their boss, but this guy wasn't just complaining. He called his boss a worthless fool that no one could talk to, and he said that to the boss's wife. Well, the focus of this lesson, of course, is on Abigail and her stepping in to keep a bad situation from getting worse. But I believe we've got to give this servant some credit as well. Imagine what it took for him to approach the boss's wife and to share this information. Without him doing that, it appears the outcome of this story would have been vastly different. The servant also stepped in to help alleviate a bad situation, even though he only presented a problem without any possible solutions. Well, before we get to our next set of verses, we need to understand what Abigail did after hearing that information about her husband's reaction to David's reasonable request. Without telling Nabal what she was doing, Abigail took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 60 pounds of roasted grain, 100 raisin cakes, and 200 fig cakes, and loaded them on some donkeys. And that's a lot of work to do behind someone's back, right? The husband had no idea what was going on. Her servants were in on it too, because they went ahead of her on this journey of reconciliation. Well, let's say your friend is starting to hang out with the wrong crowd, and not for evangelistic purposes. What prevents us from intervening to help avoid it getting worse than it already is? It could be that we think we're too busy, or we don't want to get involved. We also might be afraid of hurting their feelings and potentially losing a friendship. We're going to skip down now to 1 Samuel 25 and look at verses 23 through 28. So what has Abigail done? She has taken action. She's been proactive. She was decisive. She saw that something was bad and was about to happen, and she decided to do something about it. And she was humble in this situation as well. You see that as she fell at David's feet and referred to herself as his servant. She made amends for the situation by taking lots of food. Judging from the list of items she took, it was obvious that Nabal was quite wealthy. It also indicated that his estate was really large because Abigail was able to assemble all that food and leave without him even knowing about it. Now, her speech to David was much more than trying to butter him up. She was earnestly pleading for the lives of not just Nabal, but his servants as well. And actually, by the way she described her husband, I'm not sure that she was that concerned about his well-being. She basically said, "Stupid is as stupid does, and my husband is stupid and does stupid things." Well, let's go on down to 1 Samuel 25, verses 32 through 35. How did David respond to Abigail's gifts of food? He praised God that she came to him, and then he praised her for her good judgment because her proactive action prevented his vengeful reaction, which was to kill every man associated with Nabal by dawn of the very next day. David accepted her gift and granted her request. And now, here's what Paul Harvey used to call the rest of the story, which isn't in our lesson text. Abigail returned home after meeting with David. Nabal was feasting and was drunk, and the next morning she told him everything she had done. And the Bible says he became as stone. And I'm thinking maybe that was a stroke. Can't you see someone with his temperament getting so mad about a situation that he had a stroke? It says he died 10 days later. David heard about this and took Abigail as his wife. Well, how would you characterize Nabal? Probably terms like foolish, selfish, not open to correction, all those would come to mind. What about Abigail? How would you characterize her? Humble, wise, respectful, diplomatic, kind. So how did this ornery guy end up married to such a wonderful woman? Well, you got to remember the times, the culture. In those days, most marriages were arranged. So she likely had no say about her groom. Well, knowing when to and when not to step in, that's very important. We aren't called to stick our nose into every little thing, but when you encounter a situation you believe might require your intervention, why don't you do these things? First of all, pray about it. Okay, that makes sense, doesn't it? Pray about it. Then to honestly evaluate your attitude, your motives. Why are you considering stepping in? And then if you do decide to step in, to intervene, you need to approach that situation carefully with humility and love. Stepping in isn't always easy. It's a risk, and it doesn't always turn out the way we want. Sometimes you lose a friend. And sometimes you're called some not so nice names for trying to help. But the long-term benefits, or the attempted benefits, are worth that short-term inconvenience. So, is there a situation in your church, in your Sunday school class, or in your personal life that needs intervening? Most likely, it's not going to get better on its own. The longer the issue remains unaddressed, the longer that situation has to fester and become even worse. I believe we're called to step in as part of our ministry of reconciliation that we see in 2 Corinthians 5:18. Aren't you thankful that God intervened in human history and sent Jesus, the Messiah, the Savior? He just didn't sit back and say, "Oh, well, these people got themselves into a mess. Let's see them get out of it on their own." He didn't say that. He intervened out of love. The same reason we should step in when needed. Next week, our lesson's going to be it's going to be the first one in September. That means it's going to be the first one for the quarter. It means it's going to be the first one for a new unit. That new unit is called Staying True in a World Far from God. We'll first examine Daniel and his strong convictions as we learn about developing our own strong convictions. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget, pray for and with your class. Thank you, guys.